Resourceful Designer, episode 179, Niching, Stalking Your Client Herd.
Welcome to the Resourceful Designer podcast, offering solutions to streamline your graphic and web design business so you can get back to designing. And now, your host. He doesn't mind spoilers when it comes to movies or TV shows. Mark Des Cotes.
Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for tuning in. In this episode, I'm going to talk about my recent experience finding clients at a conference. I'm also going to share a tip when it comes to working with stubborn clients. And I'm going to end the episode with a question from Julianne about charging sales tax. Now, what have I been up to? Well, I'm playing a little bit of catch-up this week. As you'll hear in this episode, I was at a podcasting conference last week in sunny Orlando, Florida, and I had a great time. But that also means that I had a week's worth of emails and phone calls to respond to upon my return, which is always a lot of fun. And of course, I'm saying that sarcastically. Now, before I go any further, I just want to give a quick shout out to Joseph. He's a Resourceful Designer listener who met with me for dinner on my first night in Orlando. There were supposed to be a few others who were going to join us, but in the end, they couldn't make it. But Joseph and I had a great time discussing the design industry and talking business strategies and that. So thank you very much for joining me, Joseph. And just on a note here, I never did go back to that place to get the dessert that I said I would. Now, I have a question for you. I'm reading Superfans right now. It's a new book by Pat Flynn. I actually attended his book launch party in Orlando at the podcast conference. He held his book launch party there. And the purpose of this new book that he just wrote is to help you build an audience, which in turn will grow your business. Now, one of the chapters in the book talks about giving your audience an identity by giving it a name. Pat calls his followers Team Flynn because of his name, Pat Flynn. And just to give you an example, some others, Ian Paget, also known as Logo Geek, he has his community in his podcast, and he calls his audience Logo Geeks. Makes sense? Lady Gaga names her fans her little monsters. The Green Bay Packers has its cheeseheads. That one's for you, Wayne. And of course, Star Trek has, well, they have Trekkers and Trekkies, which I'm not going to get into the whole difference between the two, but there is. And this got me thinking, what would be a good name for you? Someone who's a loyal follower, a loyal listener of Resourceful Designer. Because, after all, I didn't call this show Resourceful Designer because of me. I called it Resourceful Designer because of you and all the other designers out there who want to be resourceful in running their design business. So what should I call you? Team RD? The RD Squad or RD Crew? The Resourceful Regiment? Resourcefuls? The RD Gang? I don't know. If you have a catchy or fun moniker for Resourceful Designer listeners, send it to me via email, feedback@resourcefuldesigner.com. We'll see if we can come up with a fun name for ourselves. But until then, let me move on and share with you a tip of the week this week, and that's dealing with difficult or stubborn clients. Now, I got this idea because of Sarah posting something in the Facebook group. And Sarah's not the only one. I've seen this sort of comment many times before in the Resourceful Designer group, in the Logo Geek group, in many other Facebook groups, and online in all sorts of places. And that's when a client, no matter what your best intentions or your best interests, just doesn't seem to understand what you are offering them design-wise. The client wants you to do something, and you know darn well that really it doesn't work, or it doesn't suit them, or whatever. I think back to when I was a fresh designer, and I've shared this story on the podcast before, where I had somebody that wanted me to add a fish to his logo that I was designing. And his business, he was a carpentry business, and the only reason he wanted to add a fish was because he had taken his 10-year-old son fishing the previous weekend, and his son loved it, and he thought his son would get a kick out of his father having a fish in his logo. Which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. Now, at the time, I was too fresh a designer to argue. I added a fish to the logo because that's what the client asked for. But now I know better. Now I would try to talk the client out of it. But sometimes you will come across a difficult or a stubborn client like Sarah was talking about in the Facebook group. And in those cases, sometimes it's just easier to make the client happy by doing what they ask. even if it goes against your best design judgment. Sometimes it's just not worth arguing with them or trying to push them towards a direction that you know is the better choice when it's something that they don't want. In Sarah's case, the client insisted on using a font that did not suit their business at all. So my tip is, in the end, you try to convince your clients that you know better. You are a professional designer. You have the experience to share with them and tell them what will and won't work. But in the end, it's their business. If they insist on something, just do it. It's not worth the headaches to try to argue with them and potentially lose them as a client. So that's my tip of the week, is simply when you have a stubborn or difficult client, just do what the client asks, even if it goes against your best judgment as a designer. Remember that not everything you design has to go in your portfolio. So go ahead, design it for the client, and then never show it to anybody again. Although in hindsight, I really wish I had a copy of that logo that I put the fish on. I would love to share that one with you. Anyway, now let's get right into it. Niching, stalking your client herd. Now, I had a completely different topic scheduled for this week, but after attending Podcast Movement in Orlando last week, I decided I really wanted to talk to you about my experience there and share how my experience can help with you growing your design business. Now, to get the full story, I'm going to have to give you a little bit of background. This is the 5th time that I've attended Podcast Movement. They hold it every year. They move it around. It's in different cities. This year it was in Orlando. Last year was in Philadelphia. Well, anyways, this is the 5th year that I've attended. This is their 6th year total. I did buy the virtual ticket for the very first year, but I wasn't able to attend the conference in person. So technically, I've been to 6 of them, but one of them was virtually. But I have been to every one since that 2nd year when I first attended. Now, the first one I attended was in Texas, and that was in 2015. That was before I launched Resourceful Designer. I knew Resourceful Designer was coming, but it was a few months away. I hadn't quite yet launched it yet. I was still working out some stuff, how I was going to go about it, the format of the show and all that. But I was a podcaster at the time. Back then, and well, actually, in fact, I still am doing TV show fan podcasts. If you're a fan of the science fiction television shows Killjoys or The Expanse, which, if you're not familiar with, it was a show playing on Sci-Fi in the US and Space in Canada. It got canceled and then was picked up by Amazon, and the new season of The Expanse will be coming out December 13th. Well, I do TV show fan podcasts for those and some other retired TV shows over on my network at solotalkmedia.com. Now, I'm going to go on a little bit of a side note here. That website, solotalkmedia.com, in case you're interested, that's the very first website I ever built using WordPress. In fact, it still looks exactly the same as the day I built it in 2013. You see, back then, I was hand coding all my websites. I was completely against WordPress. I actually used it as part of my sales pitch. See, back then, I didn't believe that designing with WordPress involved designing because it was all based on themes that other people had designed. So in my mind, it was a little bit of a cop-out. You bought a theme that somebody else designed, you changed the copy and the photos, and voila, you had a website. But it was a website that could potentially look like hundreds or possibly thousands of other people's websites out there who use the same theme. And that's how I used to convince clients to hire me, because I always told them, you want a custom site, a site that nobody else has, and I can do that for you, as opposed to a WordPress site that looks familiar to everybody. So part of my sales pitch back then was denouncing WordPress. But then when I got into podcasting, I was told that the easiest thing to do in order to create a podcast is to have a WordPress site, because WordPress can generate the RSS feed. And anyways, I'm not going to get into the whole technical stuff. So I reluctantly installed WordPress on my host and started solotalkmedia.com and played around with it. And just in case anybody's interested, that's actually using the Evolution theme from Elegant Themes, which was one of their themes before Divi came out. Now, I've obviously changed my attitude towards WordPress since then, especially once Divi came out, because I saw how versatile that theme was, or the page builder was, even way back in version 1. Version 3 is out now, and I actually met somebody at the podcast conference who told me that version 4 will be coming out before the end of the year. And he gave me a little bit of insider insight into some of the features with Divi 4, and man, I can't wait for it to come out. Especially, and I'll share this little secret here with you, Divi 4 will give us full control over the header and the footer. So that was one of the drawbacks with Divi, is you had very limited control on how your header looks and how your footer looks. You can do just about anything in between, but you had limited control. Well, Divi 4 will give you full control so you can design the header and the footer to anything you want. And I can't wait for that one to come out. If you're interested and you're not a Divi user, you can get a discount by visiting resourcefuldesigner.com/trydivi. That gives you currently, I think it's a 10% discount on that page, where you can sign up and save some money. Anyways, that's enough of that tangent. I just wanted to tell you about solotalkmedia.com and the very first website I did. But anyways, so my very first podcast movement that I attended, I was there as a TV show fan podcaster. And I learned a lot about podcasting that I ended up using in Resourceful Designer. In 2016, I attended the show as both a TV show fan podcaster and as host of Resourceful Designer, because at that time, Resourceful Designer had been launched and it had been less than a year, but it had been out there. But when I signed up, my attendee badge said Mark Des Cotes, and underneath it said Solo Talk Media, because I was known as a TV podcaster back then. Now, when I went to the conference in 2017 and 2018, I made sure that Resourceful Designer was front and center. I made sure that they changed my badge so it said Mark Des Cotes, Resourceful Designer underneath it. And they introduced an app, and in the app you can have a bio. All attendees had a chance to put a bio, so I made sure that my bio talked about Resourceful Designer and no mention of Solo Talk Media, because that's my hobby. I do Solo Talk Media as a hobby. Resourceful Designer is more business oriented. So when I was at the conference, if somebody talked about podcasts and all that, Solo Talk Media was kind of like an afterthought in the conversation. I would say like, yes, I'm a podcaster, I do Resourceful Designer. And if the conversation continued, I might mention that I also do Solo Talk Media and do TV show podcast. But at that point, Resourceful Designer was my main show. Now, attending the conference as the host of Resourceful Designer started to get my name out there as a designer. After all, I was doing a podcast related to the design industry, so I must be a designer, right? And what started happening was whenever the topic of podcast artwork, of social media branding, of websites, or anything that had to do with design came up, sometimes my name would start getting passed around. But it was always in the context of, oh, you need artwork, or oh, you need a website? Well, did you know Mark's a designer? Maybe he can help you. Maybe you should talk to him. So it was just, I was a designer, which was great. My name was getting out there. But it was piled in with other designers. Like, oh, Mark's a designer, but so's so-and-so a designer. Or, you might know this other designer, but Mark's one of them. So I was in the pile. I was another designer just like any other designer that was there or any other designer that the people talking knew about, which was fun and nice for me, but it didn't give me a whole lot of traction. I didn't really get any business out of it. But this year, I decided to do something different. Now, in case you're not aware, in February of this year, 2019, I started a side company along with my regular design business, Marksman Design. That's my regular design business. On the side of that, I started another business called Podcast Branding. And that website, podcastbranding.co, you can check it out if you want. I started that as kind of a niche project in the design space. Now, I talked about niches in episode 54 and episode 93 of the podcast. Not to mention, I did an interview with Craig Burton in episode that was 174, where we talked about him working in the school branding niche. And by the way, if you want to get the links to these episodes will be in the show notes. But if you ever want to find an episode that I mention, it's always resourcefuldesigner.com/the word episode and then the number. So in this case, episode 54, episode 93, and episode 174. So just so you know, that's the easiest way to find a past episode if you want to. Well, I decided to take my own advice that I had been sharing in those episodes about niches. And I know some of you call it niches, but I call it niches. And I developed a company that focused on the podcast niche. Podcast Branding was born. Now, I literally did this 2 weeks before a different podcast conference. There's another conference called PodFest, which is not as big as Podcast Movement, the main one that I go to. And I had never been to PodFest before. And I hadn't been planning on attending. That one was in March of this year. I hadn't planned on attending, But somebody that I knew was offering me a free ticket. For some reason, he had an extra ticket and he offered me the ticket for free. And he offered me a place to stay because the room he had rented had an extra bed. And he said, it won't cost you anything. You can stay here. So I decided to go at the last minute. All I had to pay was the plane ticket to get down. And it just so happened that one was in Orlando, Florida as well. So in March, I got down to Orlando and I attended that conference. Now, to give you a little bit of context about podcast conferences, the icebreaker question whenever you meet somebody new is, do you have a podcast? After all, the majority of people attending these conferences are there because they either have a podcast or they're thinking of starting a podcast. So the easiest thing to do when you meet somebody, you got to remember these are networking events. So when you meet somebody, you ask, do you have a podcast? And if it's yes, so what's your podcast? If it's no, are you thinking of starting a podcast? So at that conference back in March, whenever the question came up, I answered, yes, I do have a podcast. And I would tell them about Resourceful Designer. Again, Solo Talk Media was an afterthought. If it came up, it came up. If it didn't, it didn't. I would tell them about Resourceful Designer. And I would also mention that I do podcast branding, where I do artwork and websites and that for podcasters. Now that worked out well for me. And over the course of that conference, I ended up picking up a few new clients, enough for me to pay for my trip. Remember, I didn't pay for the ticket and I didn't pay for my lodging. It was just the plane ticket and my meals while I was there. But I made enough from the clients I picked up there to cover the cost of that trip. Now let's fast forward to Podcast Movement, the conference I attended last week. When I went to this one, I decided to go with a completely different strategy. I decided that this year I was going there to promote podcast branding. The fact that I'm also a podcaster, that I have Resourceful Designer and the various shows at Solo Talk Media, that would be an afterthought if it ever came up. So I made sure that my conference badge said Mark Des Cotes, podcast branding. And I made sure that my bio on the app that was available was all about what I can offer as a designer in the podcast space. So whenever I would meet somebody at any of the multiple networking events or just throughout the conference as we were going from session to session or whatever, whenever somebody asked, do you have a podcast? This time I answered, yes, I do, but I'm here promoting my company, Podcast Branding. And then the rest of the conversation would focus on their branding needs, what they're doing, and possibly how I could offer help to them. Very few people did I actually talk about Resourceful Designer to, because really none of them are designers. None of them are going to listen to my podcast. The funny thing is the TV show podcast, the ones that I'm really not talking about, some people might actually be interested in them, but again, they're just a hobby. And if I pick up another 10, 20 people listening to it, it's not a big deal to me. Or if I don't, it's not a big deal. Now, if you've been listening to Resourceful Designer for a while, you will have heard me talk in past episodes about using t-shirts to attract clients. When I first started my design business back in 2005, 2006, around that era, I got several new clients by attending local trade shows. These were just local all-purpose trade shows. We had the spring show and the fall show and that. I would go to these shows wearing a shirt that said, "Hi, I'm a website designer. Is your site working for you?" with a big question mark. And people would come up and say, "Hey, you design websites?" And you got to remember, this was in 2005, between 2005 and 2006. So people would come up, they weren't too familiar with websites. It was something really scary. Nobody was using WordPress, or barely anybody. I don't even remember when WordPress started, so maybe it wasn't even around back then. But it was something that, because I mentioned that I was a website designer, people that were interested, might not have had a website for their business, they would come up and ask me about it. So I picked up clients back then. Well, I'm happy to say that almost 15 years later, I put this t-shirt idea to the test again. I had 5 different colored t-shirts that I made up this year. I wanted them all to be different colors because, for one, I didn't want people to think I was wearing the same shirt every day of the conference. That might give a bad impression. But I just had 5 different ones. Now, I only ended up wearing 4 because it was a 4-day conference. I had an extra one just in case I spilt something on myself or whatever. But the message I had on the t-shirt, first of all, was the logo for podcast branding on the front. And on the back of the t-shirt, I had, "I create visual identities for podcasts. Let's talk." And then a URL underneath it. And you know what happened? My name started getting passed around to anyone who mentioned podcast artwork or websites or doing artwork for social media. Anything that had to do with design, my name started getting passed around. And throughout the conference, people were coming up to me, tapping me on the shoulder and saying, "Hey, hi, I'm so-and-so. So-and-so over there said I should talk to you." Either that or somebody would come up to me and say, hey, I saw your t-shirt. Can you talk to me more about this? And what was great is almost every one of these conversations that I ended up having, and these are conversations that I did not initiate. This is somebody coming up to me. Almost every single one of them ended with them asking if I had a business card. I wasn't, at some of these conferences, you get what they call business card ninjas. Those are the people that say, hi, I'm so-and-so, and hand a card. Hi, I'm so-and-so, hand a card, hand a card, hand a card. I don't do that. I judge how the reaction's going, and if I deem it that they're interested, I will hand them a card. Well, almost every one of these conversations, when somebody came up and asked me, they asked me for a card, which I took as a really, really good sign. And quickly, over the course of the 4 days, I gained recognition, not as Mark, the graphic designer who can possibly help you, but as Mark, the guy who specializes in artwork and websites for podcasters. Now, a funny thing is that sometimes when people will come up to me and say, oh, so-and-so said I should talk to you, half the time I had no idea who so-and-so was. They would say, oh yeah, John whatever Doe over there told me I should talk to you. And I don't know who John Doe is, but it might have been somebody I had talked to previously, and they knew that, oh, well, this guy does branding for podcasters. So I was getting known as the podcast designer. And now, for the first time since attending these conferences, people were searching me out. Now, this just goes to show that being available to a niche, which most designers are, and I've always been, compared to actively focusing on a niche, that's two different things. For years, I've been saying, yes, I will design for podcasters. But this year, I'm saying I specialize in designing for podcasters. And it wasn't until I made that distinction where I focused on podcasters as a target that things really, really took off for me. And just for the record, I landed 2 confirmed web projects at the conference, handshakes, and I've already sent off the contracts. Contracts are signed, deposits have been received. I'm in talks with 2 others about their website, and there's plenty more people that sounded really enthusiastic about working together. Many of them not quite podcasters yet. They're in the early stages. They're planning. They were at the conference to learn, and they took my information because they don't know what to do about a website, and I'm the guy that specializes in podcast websites. So that's great. And that's not counting several podcast logo projects, cover arts, social media branding that I also got as well. And now that I'm back home, the emails with, hi, Mark, I met you at Podcast Movement, and so on, those emails are starting to come in now, and I'm replying, and we're starting to get some conversations going. So the first conference back in March that I only had to pay for plane ticket and food, it didn't cost me anything for lodging or the ticket. I picked up a couple of clients there that was enough to pay for the trip. This time, where it was a longer conference, more expensive ticket, room that I had to pay for, meals that I had to pay for the week, and everything, I've already paid all of that off, and I've already made a good income just from the 2 clients I've signed up and some of the other small things that I'm doing. And I anticipate that in the weeks to come and months to come, there's going to be more and more stuff coming in. So I put my money where my mouth is, and I took my own advice, the advice that I've been sharing on the podcast, and I attended a conference where my target market was. I promoted a business that was focused on that target market. And my name is now slowly spreading amongst that market as the person to talk to when it comes to their branding needs. Now, yes, I had attended this conference many times in the past. This was my 5th time attending Podcast Movement. But I don't believe that had a lot of sway in the way things turned out this year. In fact, only one of the clients that I picked up was somebody that I knew from previously. This was a woman that I actually met at the very first conference, and I've talked to her every year since then. But the funny thing is that she told me that this conference, she was talking to somebody about websites, and somebody says, well, why don't you just get Mark? And she goes, who? And she says, Mark Des Cotes. Turns out she didn't know I was a designer. She knew me as a TV show fan podcaster. So she was all surprised when people kept telling her, you got to talk to Mark. You got to talk to Mark. You got to talk to Mark. So she came up to me and says, I've known you for years. I didn't know you were a designer. So I know that wasn't the payoff. Now, maybe the payoff was that because she's known me for years, and when people said that she should hire Mark, she already knows me. We have a relationship going back for several years. So I'm sure that had some play in the fact that she signed on right there. We shook hands on everything and I sent her the contract and she signed it, no questions. But for everybody else, they were all people I did not know. Now, they may have been referred from somebody that I do know, but a lot of them were referred from people that I had just met. So if you, in your design business, you're targeting a certain niche, even if you're doing it as a side gig to your regular design business, the way I'm currently doing this now, the best thing you can do is to go where your target market is. Hence the title for this episode, which I know is not very creative, but I called this episode Stalking Your Client Herd. Because after all, what better place to network than a large gathering of your ideal target market while they have their business at the forefront of their mind? There are conferences out there for just about any niche or industry that you can think of. There are conferences dedicated to yoga. There are restaurant conferences. There are medical conferences for just about any field in the medical industry, real estate conferences, automotive conferences, electronics, digital media, marketing, banking. It doesn't matter what industry you are focusing on, where your niche is, there is probably a conference somewhere for that industry. And I know it's not always feasible. Going to a conference is expensive. In my case, yes, I was kind of killing two birds with one stone because it's a podcast conference and I want to keep up with the podcast industry and that. So it made sense. But now I'm actually looking at other podcast conferences, not conferences I normally attend, but I'm looking at them to see if it might be feasible for me to go to those ones promoting podcast branding. So if you can manage it, try to attend a conference where your target market gathers. Try to establish yourself as the designer who specializes in that market. Get your name out there. Become known in the space. It may take time, but the payoff is enormous. As I've mentioned in the previous episodes that I've talked about niching, most clients are willing to spend more money on a designer who specializes in their industry because they see the added value in hiring them. Why spend X amount of dollars on a generic graphic designer when you can hire a specialized graphic designer that knows your industry, that understands it, that knows how your business works? Even if that costs them a little bit more, in the end, most clients will think that's a worthwhile investment. So you can charge more when you're specializing in a certain niche. And even if you don't pick up any work at a conference, don't view it as a bust. When the time comes, when one of your target market clients does require design services, there's a very good chance that they will decide to choose you over someone else. Because, once again, you are a designer that understands them. You understand their industry because that's where you specialize. So it becomes a no-brainer for them. Why hire a general web designer to design your new restaurant's website when you can hire a designer who specializes in designing websites for restaurants? Think about that. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. I had a really good experience at Podcast Movement, but this year, as I said, my focus was on my business and not on the podcast. I talked to very few people about Resourceful Designer, and I think only one or two people did I ever mention Solo Talk Media. But everybody I talk to knows that I am the guy behind podcastbranding.co. And yes, my t-shirt idea still works. Now, I would love to know if you have ever attended a conference in order to try to pick up clients. Please leave me a comment for this episode. Visit resourcefuldesigner.com/episode 179 and let me know. And now, this week's question of the week. This week's question comes in from Julianne. And it's simply, I'm curious if you have any resources on how to charge sales taxes for prints. Well, thank you very much for the question, Julianne. And this is a really hard question to answer because it all depends on tax laws. Depending on where you are, you either have to charge sales tax, you don't, or there's certain rules. I know here where I am in Ontario, I think the rule, and I might be wrong. First of all, let me put the disclaimer out. I'm not an accountant. I'm not a tax expert or that, so don't take any of my advice as the golden rule. But I remember when I started, there was a certain amount here, and I don't know if it's changed or not. I think it was $30,000. If your business was had less than $30,000 income for the year, you didn't have to charge sales tax to your clients. But if you were going to make more than $30,000, you had to charge. It's mandatory for you to charge sales tax. But the way things work here is I only have to charge sales taxes to other residents of Ontario. So if I'm dealing with somebody in British Columbia or Quebec, I can opt not to charge them. Now, the other thing I can do is I could charge everybody. So say somebody from British Columbia wants to order something from me, I can charge them sales tax. And because their tax is less in British Columbia, I think British Columbia is less. I might be wrong with that. I know Alberta is less, so I'll use Alberta as an example. If somebody from Alberta ordered something from me, they have the option to submit a claim to the Ontario government to get whatever they pay in taxes back. But I would still collect it. And I have a tax number that then at the end of the year, the way my thing works, some places it's quarterly or monthly, but mine is annually. So at the end of the year, when I get my taxes filled out, my accountant also does my sales tax filings. And then he lets me know this is how much of the sales tax you collected you have to submit to the government. As far as resources go, Julianne, I'm not sure exactly. The best bet is talk to a local accountant or talk to your local municipality about sales taxes, or your local state or province or country, depending. I don't know where you are in the world, but talk to them. They will have the rules. And as I said, most places, you don't have to charge sales tax unless your business is bringing in a certain amount of income. And once you break that threshold, then you have to. It becomes mandatory that you have to collect taxes. Now, in my case, I remember back when I first started out, I anticipated that I would be making enough money. So I started collecting taxes from day one. Even though I didn't know if I would meet that threshold, I just anticipated I would. So it was just easier for me to collect taxes. But again, I think the best bet for you is to contact an accountant. Ask them. You should have an accountant that you can contact for this sort of stuff for your business. It's almost mandatory if you're running your own business. And find out the rules. Find out if you're selling, you asked specifically for selling prints. Find out the rules. What happens if you sell to somebody locally? What happens if you sell to somebody around the world? If you are in the US and you're selling a print to somebody in Australia, do you have to charge them sales tax? I don't know. That's something that your jurisdiction, wherever you are, your state, your province, your country, they will determine that, and you have to follow those rules. So the best thing to do is talk to an expert, talk to an accountant, or you can talk to your bank. They may know as well. Or if you don't want to pay for the accountant, or banks usually don't charge, check your municipality wherever you live to see if they have a business center. A lot of cities will run a business center or an economic development center that talks about that sort of thing. You can even ask your local chamber of commerce. So that's my answer, Julianne, is just talk to whoever is local and they will give you the best advice on whether or not you have to charge sales tax for prints. Even if you're selling online through something like Etsy, it usually depends on where you physically are located. So thank you very much for that question. Now, if you would like to have me answer your question in a future episode, submit yours by visiting resourcefuldesigner.com/feedback, and I'll try to answer it to the best of my ability in a future episode. So that's it for this episode. And don't forget, I did ask you at the beginning of this podcast, if you could come up with a good name to call the Resourceful Designer audience, please email it to me at feedback@resourcefuldesigner.com. I think it would be kind of fun to have some sort of moniker to call ourselves. So thank you very much for listening. I always appreciate it, especially if you stick around to the end and you're hearing this message. It does mean an awful lot to me, and I can't wait to be back in your ears for next week's episode. But until then, I am Mark Des Cotes, wishing you all the best with your graphic design business and reminding you to stay creative.
Thanks for listening to the Resourceful Designer podcast at resourcefuldesigner.com.